This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Greetings. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. First, Mikolaj from Poland says, what would be a biological explanation of Marchetti's constant? There is some evidence even people in early Neolithic settlements walked no further than 30 minutes away to reach their fields or storage areas.
Marchetti's constant. I'll have to admit that this was a new one for me, and it's very interesting. Marchetti, Cesare Marchetti, is an Italian physicist who did not discover Marchetti's constant. Instead, apparently, he was an urban planner named Yakov Zahavi, who Marchetti always gives credit to. And apparently, Zahavi didn't discover it, and that it was first described by Bertrand Russell. Here's what the constant is: the notion that psychologically, people budget approximately a half hour each way for commuting to work, and that this has been a constant over a huge amount of time. What this has as an implication is throughout history, as forms of transportation have gotten faster, people don't spend less time traveling to work. They get to live further from the center of town, further from where their work is. And this has been documented historically over 2,000 years in Rome, in London, in Berlin, studies from 1815 to 1950, as there was the transition from walking to work to taking a horse tram, to taking an electric tram, to taking a subway, to a car. What you saw was the perimeter of the city kept growing outwards, such that roughly the amount of commuting time from the edge to the center of the city remains constant at about 30 minutes. Okay, so what is this about? This seems to be remarkably widespread. It's been shown historically with Boston, with Chicago, with Lisbon in Portugal, with Abidjan in Ivory Coast. And the notion is there's some sort of clock in people's head as to what seems to count as a reasonable amount of time for going to work. And you look at every European country and you average it out, and it comes out to about 29 minutes, although there's some indication that it's beginning to stretch a little bit longer. So this is Marchetti's constant. And for people who care about Marchetti's constant, there's been all sorts of trauma in recent years, as there's been interesting violations of it. First one, of course, completely upending, has been people telecommuting, people working remotely from home. Another is this whole trend of live workspaces. Another is an interesting sort of switch in urban development as to where the wealthy live. Now, traditionally, in cities, the wealthy live out in the suburbs. Why do they live out there? Because there's more space and it's peaceful and it's quiet and the schools are better and all sorts of advantages there. And thus, pretty much the commuting time was defining the perimeter of the suburbs for any given city. But then you have apparently a fairly recent trend, which is to have the super rich, the uber rich, wanting to live in the middle of their metropolitan areas. It's more cosmopolitan. There's all sorts of uber rich enclaves that develop, like the Upper East Side in Manhattan or Pacific Heights in San Francisco. And what you've seen in San Francisco, for example, is not just that usual super uber rich in their neighborhood, but in recent years, the biggest influx of tech money the world has ever seen, so that there's been a massive influx of people who are at least well off, who want to now follow this pattern, forget living in the suburbs and commuting. I want to live a 5-minute walk from work in downtown San Francisco. And what the most interesting consequences of that have been, something that has been much lamented and alarming for cities functioning normally, which is working people, service people, can't afford to live in the city they do their work in. And one is endlessly hearing stories about the small towns between San Francisco and Silicon Valley, where now every single member of the police force is driving at least 2 hours each day to get to work. Every firefighter in the city is more than 3 hours away. All sorts of police departments and nursing establishments are setting up RVs in their parking lots so that the people who are, by the way, completely violating Marchetti's constant because they've been pushed way out there are having to travel insane distances to get to the places they are policing and preventing the fires. So that's been changing. Amid that being the depressing sign, as technology gets better for transportation, people don't spend less time getting to work. They get to live further away from work. You see something else that goes with it. And this one is called Javon's paradox. And this one is so terrible and tragic, which is with each technological advance that makes it easier to get work done, we don't work less. We have more expected from us. There's more expectations of productivity. And this has been well documented as well. And this is the whole world that now that like any boss can reach you 24/7 on your iPhone, you're supposed to be in effect on call 24/7. Each new technological advance has not led to more free time. It has led to more expectations, more productivity at work. Now, this gives rise to another paradox called Bray's paradox, which is really interesting and initially totally counterintuitive. And the notion of it is that the shortest path between two places is not necessarily the fastest. And when that's applied, it's if you open up a new road that's a shortcut between two prior ones, amazingly, bizarrely, counterintuitively, on the average, people's commute time gets bigger, longer. Why is this? Because this great new shortcut is opened up, and thus everybody takes the shortcut, and there's horrible traffic jams. And this brings to mind the famed Yogi Berra quote of, nobody goes to that restaurant anymore because it's always so crowded. The inverse of it is everyone goes to that restaurant because it's always empty. Everyone initially goes to the shortcut because it's always so empty. And then it winds up, in fact, being slower than the prior pathways. And this has been documented now in urban settings when a new cut through freeway is put up or something, it slows down commute time. And the converse has been shown as well, which is knock down one of these connectors of highways and people's commute times get better. Essentially, what you see, what would be the solution, is what evolutionary biology people call context dependent fluctuation, which is to say, when there's lots of people going to this restaurant, go to the empty one. When there's lots of people going to that one, switch the other way. When there's lots of people using this road, switch to the other one, and so on. And that's the optimal solution to this Bray's paradox. If everybody wants to go this way because it's the shortest, go that way instead. Constantly flip flop back and forth. Now, where this gets very interesting is circumstances where you can't flip flop back and forth. And this brings up some really interesting physiology. For example, a recent study in the journal Circulation Research looking at when you have clogging of coronary arteries and you put in a bypass, you get a blood vessel, a healthy, nice, spanking, clean blood vessel from somewhere else in the person's body, and you attach it into the heart. So now most of the blood that used to be getting all jammed up in this congested, inflamed blood vessel now gets to go through this new clean bypass. And what you see is a Bray's paradox there, in that all the red blood cells want to get where they're going as fast as possible. And there's mass action effects so that the net speed that the blood moves through with this new pathway slows down. Another interesting version of this was a recent paper in an oncology journal. Okay, you're a tumor. When a tumor first establishes itself, the key thing about tumors is they have incredibly high metabolic rates because they're dividing and dividing, and they need tons of energy, and they do all these tricks to steal glucose from the bloodstream. Another thing tumors do is they send out a signal to cause the nearest blood vessels to grow lots of capillaries into them to deliver lots of blood. and glucose and oxygen, a process called angiogenesis, discovered by this guy, Judah Folkman at Harvard in the 70s, and the usual deal that nobody believed him for the rest of his life. This is one of the major things tumors do. They release angiogenesis stimulating factors, which make the blood vessels grow these great capillary beds to it. So, of course, immediately when people decided they believed that this was actually going on, they accepted this. The strategy became to get anti-angiogenic drugs out there that would block the growth of new capillaries to tumors. Huge excitement with that. That was going to revolutionize everything. And I think it's fair to say that overall, the outcome has been so-so. It's helpful, but it's not anywhere near as helpful as lots of people were expecting. And for some reason, it's not very helpful. And this paper says the explanation might be Bray's paradox. Okay, you get an injury, a wound injury, and in the aftermath, the subsequent weeks, you grow new capillaries to the injury site as it's recovering. And it's this very regulated process. And you come up with a very tightly regulated capillary tree that optimizes blood delivery while minimizing how much you have to spend on capillary walls. Tumors, when they are triggering angiogenesis, the angiogenesis is completely chaotic and out of control, and you get loops and you get shunts and you get dead ends and you get all these excessive branching things. And the idea is, under those circumstances, you can get the whole system to work better by trimming away some of the superfluous capillaries. Because by a Bray's paradox, more capillaries don't equal a faster transit time. In fact, it's being slowed by this chaotic vasculature that tumors are generating. And thus, when you're having some anti-angiogenesis factor that's blunting capillary growth, decreasing it a whole lot, you were blocking the Bray's paradox from happening, and thus the blood flows through faster. And thus, why the anti-angiogenesis therapies have not worked as well. Now, it turns out one additional biological domain where you see this happening, ants, ant trails. You see ants going from here to there through some very roundabout path. And one day somebody discovers a shortcut so that going from A to B is half the distance this way than it is that way. And what ants have is this amazing emergent complexity ability to tell that, to discover that. You start off with two ants at the beginning, and one of them takes the shortcut, and one of them takes the long route. The one who takes the shortcut gets here and back in the same length of time that this ant takes to get to there, because it's half the distance. So this ant goes and discovers the source with the shortcut, comes back, and this ant recruits somebody else. So now there's two ants that are going to go out, while this one is just beginning to come back. Comes back while these two are going out, arrives back there, while this one now recruits one ant. These two ants recruit two ants, and then four ants, and then eight ants, and you've got an exponential increase. And that's how ants wind up getting the optimal route. Totally great emergent complexity. The vulnerability is, once that happens, even ants get caught up in a Bray's paradox. All the ants use this new pathway, and it slows down their foraging time. Now, in principle, that shouldn't be happening if what the ants were keeping track of is how long is it taking me to get from A to B. And it turns out ants are not very good at estimating time. What ants are incredibly good at is measuring, counting how many steps they're taking from one place to another. That turns out to be how ants are doing their optimization. They count the number of steps, the most bizarrely elegant studies you can ever imagine, which is to anesthetize ants and glue on 6 little stilts on their legs. And the ants wobble around initially, and then they learn how to walk with it. And with the stilts on, each given step is a lot further. Do they now realize take fewer steps because I get there sooner with my larger reach? Or do they now overshoot the target? They overshoot the target. Ants are counting the number of steps, not keeping track of how long it takes, so that even ants wind up being vulnerable to this paradox. And again, as long as you're cognitively flexible and have some sort of rule in your head that whatever is most popular, you should avoid, things will work out just fine.
Now, Leo from Arkansas says, what's the deal with the handshake? It's an almost universal behavior when meeting people across many languages and cultures. Are there any animal models similar to handshakes?
Wonderful question. Do all those geckos out there shake hands when they first meet? Broadly, do animals have greeting ceremonies? And they absolutely do. Greeting rituals, things which communicate trust and comfort and familiarity and such. Chimps, when they encounter each other at the end of the day, they come up, they hold hands, they hug each other, they kiss. Bonobos do the same exact thing. Giraffe wrap their necks, lean their necks against each other. Cats rub up against each other. Elephants intertwine their trunks when they're seeing each other for the first time in a while. So these are all versions of greetings. And what are they often communicating? Trust. Trust, because often what these greetings are about is something that makes you vulnerable. Great example of this, a greeting that you see among male baboons, which is kind of irresistible. You got two males and they get along okay, and they're just walking along during the day and they're coming up. And what happens is one of them, or sometimes both of them, as they pass, will lean over and yank on the other one's penis, and then they go their way. A penis yank. What is this about? This is about the clearest measure of we feel comfortable with each other, that we are willing to be vulnerable in this way. This is when dogs greet by rolling on their backs and letting everyone put their teeth on their throat or their crotch, or these greeting signals that are all about saying, I trust you so much. Look what I'm letting you yank on. One of the really rarest things I've ever seen in terms of baboon penis yanking history was years ago in one of my troops. This female, she was the daughter of the matriarch, the alpha female, and she had grown up as one confident, domineering individual. And she was just having none of this gender role stuff. One day she's walking along and another big male is coming by. And as she passes, she does a penis yank on him and just goes walking past. And he stops there and looks underneath as if to say, wait, did I get that wrong as to who that was? These are some of the symbols, these are some of the markers of I am willing to allow myself to be vulnerable. Okay, so now we look at human greeting gestures, starting, of course, with handshakes. Great book by Torbjörn Lundmark called Tales of High and By, Greeting and Parting Rituals Around the World, which is an irresistible book. And the first thing that comes through there is shaking hands is old. It is really old. Assyrian bas relief, however you say it, Assyrian sculpting things from 9,000 years BC, showing an Assyrian king and a Babylonian king rowing together and shaking hands. Homer, throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey, all sorts of folks are shaking hands with each other. It's always been a sign of welcome and warmth. 1907, January 1st, 1907, Teddy Roosevelt, who's probably the president of all time that I would most want to have a meal with, but least want to have two meals with, because he probably would have been beyond exhausting at that point. Teddy Roosevelt set a world record that day by standing in front of the White House and shaking hands with more than 8,000 people who lined up to be wished a Happy New Year by him. And of course, that record is long fallen. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, largest number of handshakes, most people, is far larger than that. The number of people simultaneously doing handshakes, the length of time that one handshake was maintained was something like 9 hours. Okay, so handshakes have been around. Handshakes have been around, and exactly as the questioner brings up, it's almost universal. It's found in lots and lots of cultures on Earth. Some commonalities. First off, across almost all cultures, men shake hands more regularly than women do. And least common is intersexual handshakes. You also see lots of cross-cultural variation. Parts of Africa, for example, you encounter somebody and shake hands with them, and what the two of you do is you continue to hold hands for the length of the entire conversation. Or if you're in a place where you're shaking hands with somebody and they come up and they hold your hand with both hands, that means you are shaking hands with a politician who you just like gave a donation to or something. Or all these variations. You can have fist bumps and elbow bumps and shoulder bumps. Or if you think you're in the Super Bowl, you can do chest bumps and all these. Nonetheless, handshakes are very, very common worldwide. East Asian cultures, you have bows instead. Various cultures, you have their famed air kisses. One thing that nonetheless is universal with a vengeance is nobody shakes hands with their left hands. Why? Because traditionally, back before bidets were all over the place, or who knows, back when left hands were used for other things than shaking hands. And it was considered extremely gauche to shake hands with someone with your left hand. So that appears to be among almost all cultures doing handshakes with their right hands. So the question becomes, why shaking hands? Why did that evolve? And the standard explanation is it's a marker of trust. What are you doing? You are going up with, presumably for 90% of people, your dominant hand. And by shaking hands with that person, you are by definition unable to be holding a weapon in your hand. And same thing for them. And thus you've got millennia ago coins being printed showing handshakes in honor of some peace treaty or whatever. Shaking hands is a very good way of assuring that you are not carrying a weapon. Advance on that interpretation. Why not just grasping hands? Why instead shaking up and down? And the notion is if you have a literal knife up your sleeve, it would come bouncing out at that point. That one doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me because when you look at those Assyrian Babylonian kings shaking hands back when they didn't have sleeves, they had sort of modified toga things. Nonetheless, handshakes imply non-aggression, trust, cooperation, treaties, things that you could shake on that carry an enormous social convention, a social expectation of you living up to what you have shaken on. And you can see historically one of the most consequential handshakes of all time was back when Yitzhak Rabin from Israel and Yasser Arafat from Palestine shook hands over the Oslo Peace Accords. People who famously had blood on their hands, who finally were willing to shake hands. Okay, so some of the time it's all about trust, it's all about cooperation. Some of the time it's about strength. And we saw a ridiculous example of this. Really, you were too young, but when your big brother, when we were first looking for preschools for him, we went to one possible one, and the guy who was the head of the school gave this whole song and dance. And at the end, he said, if nothing else, we teach our students to come up and look you in the eye and give you a firm handshake. And, as we investigated more, it turned out that basically was all they were instructing the kids on. But that could be a marker of strength and confidence. Sometimes it could be a marker of equality. Quakers, when you sit through a Quaker meeting, which is in silence, everyone turns and shakes hands with each other. What's that about? At the time that the Quakers were first trying to get people to be a whole lot more egalitarian, what do you do if you're walking down the street and there is your social better, your social superior, some rich guy? What you do to formalize the asymmetry is you tip your hat and they do something minimal like just touch their finger to it. Whoa, a greeting gesture that was hugely reifying of status hierarchies. And what the Quakers were doing instead was taking that apart. We all just shake hands with each other as equals. Now, sometimes it does exactly the opposite, where shaking hands is a marker of you're being overly staid and uptight and unwarm. And great example of the movie Get Out, which was a wonderful movie. And at a point, the guy, the protagonist, is going to meet his future father-in-law for the first time. And he comes up very respectfully and says, "To meet you, sir." And the father-in-law says, "We're hugging people here," and grabs him and gives him a big bear hug. And whoa, isn't that great? And things turn out very, very badly for the new potential son-in-law. So communicating that as well. Okay, so amid all of these different versions of what handshakes, what greeting rituals are about, of course, there's rituals for departure. And I was very amused to see one version was what you call when somebody just in the middle of some social interaction, social setting, just picks up and leaves without a word. And it turns out in Germany, it's called a Polish exit. In France, it's called an English exit. You see where that goes from there. In terms of animals having departure rituals, there's not a whole lot of them, crocodiles saying, "See you later, alligator." But there was a recent paper in a primate journal, first evidence of rather than the hugging, kissing, interacting, greeting gestures, first indication that there might be a departure ritual. This was with chacma baboons living down in Mozambique. And this was high speed film looking at two baboons when they've been sitting there having an interaction for a while. And what does the guy do just before he picks up and leaves? At a higher than expected rate, the baboon shifts looking towards where they're about to walk off and tenses their body and then picks up. Obviously, it was like an intention gesture. They were just getting ready to get up and go. But what they showed was if the guy is sitting with some guy who he doesn't get along with, they're not having a positive interaction. He just gets up and does a Polish exit or a German exit, or if there's nobody else there, he doesn't do this orienting towards. This seems to be the first hint of some sort of departure gesture that you see in another species. Okay, so collectively, what this is showing is most of all these greeting gestures, they're about trust and cooperation and being willing to be vulnerable in front of the other individual. They're about showing firmness and strength. They're about showing equality and everybody's got the same handshakes and stuff. But then there was an utterly fascinating paper, 2015, in this journal eLife, coming from a group headed by this neuroscientist, Noam Sobel, who's a really interesting scientist. And what he was pursuing in this study was this whole notion of social chemoreception, social chemocommunication. What is this about? How people are communicating socially by way of odors. And his theory was that people shake hands in order to now get olfactory information about the person they just shook hands with. That is the most ridiculous thing you have ever heard. And what he does in this beautiful paper is show that's exactly what's going on. They got a whole bunch of people who did handshakes where they were secretly filmed. And in the 2 minutes afterward, people had, after a handshake, a much higher than chance level of then sniffing their hand. Sniffing their hand, like maybe this, but much more likely, oh, they rub the bridge of the nose, or they sniff, or they do this. Okay, so what are the controls in this study? How likely are they to sniff their left hand? Not at all likely. It's all about right hand. Okay, the other control is what if you just didn't have an interaction with that person, or you met them but you didn't shake hands? Do you sniff your hand? Those were the two controls. And what they showed was after you shake hands with somebody, there's a very elevated likelihood that you're going to sniff your hand afterward. Okay, let's find out more of what this is about because they dissected this in the paper beautifully. First off, they did some major league chemistry stuff. They had people come up and shake hands, and they showed that in the aftermath of shaking hands with someone, you had picked up some of the chemicals from the oils on their hand, in particular, a chemical called squalene, which is found in a lot of different types of pheromones. So, okay, you can prove now that there is actually a transfer of olfactory information. Next thing, is the person just putting up their right hand like this, or are they sniffing at the time? And here's the detail in this study that I loved. They got some sort of airflow tube measurement thingies, which they convinced these volunteers to stick up their noses. And just so they wouldn't think something suspicious was going on with their noses, the experimenter said, "Oh, we're monitoring a whole bunch of things. So sit down here and we're going to stick this thing up your nose and we're going to put on electrodes all over your heads and these x-ray glasses and a whole bunch," so that the person wasn't paying much attention to this. And they're sitting there and in comes the researcher and shakes their hand, says, "Oh, what a pleasure. So glad you're doing this. Thank you. Thank you for helping out," and then walks away. And what they showed, not only in the 2 to 3 minutes afterward, the person was now more likely to do some sort of gesture like this, but as their hand was passing in front of their nose, the airflow into their nose increased. They sniff. People not only put their hand up in front of their nose, they sniff more at that point. But oh, that was not the end of the study. Now, what they did was pollute people's hands with various types of positive and negative smells and perfumes and sex hormone derived perfumes that carried androgen derived odorants, that carried estrogen derived odorants, all sorts of variants on this. And what you saw was overall, people sniffed their right hand much less when they were shaking hands with somebody whose hand smelled. And in fact, as the punchline for the whole study was, if it was really something unpleasant, people then would tend to cover their nose afterward with their left hand for some reason, protecting yourself from that. Okay, so we see you can't do stuff like baboons. You can't go around and try to get information about other people you're first meeting by sniffing their armpits or sniffing their crotch. Maybe what we have developed handshakes for is not for treaties and saying you're vulnerable and having a firm son-in-law handshake, but instead just to pick up some olfactory information about this person. That could be what's going on.
And of course, one might assume that since COVID hit, we are much less likely to even want to shake someone's hand, let alone sniff our hands after doing so. So, presumably, if this study was done now, there'd be very different results. Yet another measure of COVID's impact.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is it for today. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.